10:30, we'll people will come in on a cup of tea. So 10:30, beautiful. Okay.
Almost welcome to all of you this morning. My name's Philip Britzner, and it's my absolute privilege to be the headmaster of Melbourne Grammar School and to welcome you today to a fantastic workshop hosted by our Archbishop entitled Coping with the Climate Crisis. I'd first of all like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to acknowledge any people of Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal background here today. In the title itself, Coping with the Climate Crisis, of course, it's a pretty provocative title and indeed a pretty provocative slide that is in front of us. And we're all obviously greatly concerned by the challenges that we're facing, and it's very easy to think about the doom and gloom and the future of the planet. But I've got to say I'm an optimist. In the last few years, we've seen massive changes of government around the world, and governments that are now prepared, including some fairly conservative governments, to do something about the crisis that we're facing. So I live with great hope there. And despite the inaction of our federal government over the past 15 years, we've seen in Australia how so many schools, organisations and businesses have actually got on with the hard work to tackle the significant problems that we face. In meeting with Professor Cameron Hepburn at Oxford University earlier this year, who indeed is a Rhodes Scholar and Australian, and I'm proud to say I taught him many years at Camberwell Grammar School. He also is an expert on this particular topic, and he also shares great hope. He described to me that the world economy annually is worth $100 trillion per year. He also said, as an economist, to fix the problem only requires $50 trillion. So in other words, we only need half of the world's global economic output from 1 year to tackle the significant issues that we're facing. So I live with hope there. As a school, having just released a new strategic plan, one of the significant goals in that plan is to embrace sustainability, socially, financially, and also environmentally. And in keeping with the commitment in that plan, we've just done a whole school audit of all our power, electricity, gas, and waste. And from that audit, we will engage consultants to help us to tackle the sorts of things that we can do at the local level to address the significant challenges facing our planet. And indeed, our new building, the Centre for Humanity, which will be constructed, we hope, starting in 2 years' time, will embrace environmental sustainability, and we hope it'll be a self-sustaining building and indeed a 6-star one. And I hope today, through the discussions, that you too leave our school obviously acknowledging the challenges that we're facing, but also to see that there are some many great things in action that is going to help us solve this crisis. So I'd like to, first of all, welcome Olivia Livingston, member of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, who's one of our panel members. So welcome to you, Olivia. We also welcome Jack Lohman, who's a Melbourne Grammar student and secretary of our SLIC committee. We welcome Tony Ronaldo, World Vision's Senior Climate Action Advisor. And our host, we welcome Archbishop Philip Fryer. And as Archbishop, I thank you for the brave stance that you've taken on many social issues. You've certainly led the Anglican Church, not only as our Archbishop, but as Primate, in important areas such as reconciliation, refugees, and I know more recently, the Anglican school heads certainly challenged you in relation to the diversity that we have in our schools. So thank you, Archbishop, for hosting today. And I'd like you to please join me in thanking and welcoming our panellists. Thank you very much. Over to you, Archbishop.
Well, I think we're going to
No, to you.
our MC. Thank you. Thanks for your welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Might I reiterate the headmaster's warm welcome to you all. It really is so good to see such a good turnout here, and I know online as well. My name's Jack Lindsay. I'm a clergyman here in this diocese, based at the parish of Brunswick, just on the other side of the river, representing the northern suburbs, which is good to do. This is one of the most important topics facing all of us, and I speak as someone who is very close to all of you as students in terms of age, as another young person. We will be the generation particularly responding to this, dealing with this most significant challenge, threat facing the world. And I'm sure that you will feel with me just how important this is. Your presence here indicates that. But as the headmaster has just said, this is not a threat without hope. We must remain hopeful, and it is a particular joy to see in our speakers here two up-and-coming leaders in the world on this issue, and one person who has already done so much in this critical work. So let me just give a little bit of background to our speakers before handing over to them for this discussion. Jack Lohman is a Year 11 student here at Melbourne Grammar, I'm sure known to many of you. Amongst his involvement in school life, Jack serves as secretary to the Sustainable Lifestyles Initiative Committee. Through this role, he's worked closely with his peers to encourage a more sustainable school. And this has included action on implementing a more efficient waste management system and campaigning for a more sustainable power plan, amongst, I'm sure, many other things. Jack is an avid environmentalist and feels very keenly that Australia should and can be doing more to address the global climate crisis. He's also passionate in advocating for youth involvement in this critical work, both at decision-making and at grassroots levels. And he undertakes this work like the headmaster does, in a spirit of hope, like we all should, feeling very strongly that it is only through this spirit that we, particularly as young people, stand our best chance at combating the climate crisis. So welcome to you, Jack. Olivia Sutherland is a climate activist based here in Melbourne. She works for the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, the AYCC, as their National Digital Organisation Team Co-Coordinator. Did I get that right? Good. And National Schools Team Co-Coordinator. The AYCC is Australia's largest youth-run organisation and seeks to create and empower the next generation of leaders passionate about climate justice. Over the past 2 and a bit years spent with the AYCC, Olivia's work has emphasised the importance of youth voice and agency, empowering current and future leaders to speak their minds and influence change-making. With the AYCC, she runs training sessions, summits, and in-school workshops to mentor and upskill young people in taking grassroots action to achieve climate justice. So welcome to you, Olivia. And last but certainly not least, Tony Ronaldo. Tony is one of the leading global voices in climate action and an international expert, particularly in the area of agroecology and forestry. From 1981 to 1999, Tony served as an agriculturalist and missionary in Niger with the Evangelical Christian Mission Organization serving in mission. There, he oversaw long-term rural development and periodic large-scale relief programs. Through these, he contributed to a massive transformation in how Nigerians farm and the reforestation of over 6 million hectares of land. which still inspires re-greening movements globally. For his 18 years of service to humanity and the environment, the government of Niger awarded Tony its highest honor for an expatriate, the Order of Agriculture with Merit. Since joining World Vision in 1999, Tony initiated and oversaw important land regeneration projects across the world. Serving now as Principal Climate Action Advisor, he promotes forestry and agroforestry initiatives globally within the World Vision Partnership and beyond. He is widely recognized for his influential contribution to heightened international awareness on the impact and efficacy and uptake of simple, low-cost, scalable methods of reforestation, known as farmer-managed natural regeneration. It's really worth looking into this. I spent some time yesterday doing so. It's an absolutely fascinating plan. It really is totally revolutionary and has helped millions and millions around the world. For his work on this, amongst other things, in 2018, Tony was awarded the Right Livelihood Award and also the World Future Council Agroecology Award. And in 2019, was appointed a member of the Order of Australia. It is our great privilege to have all three of these speakers joining us today and joining the Archbishop in conversation on this most important of issues. So please let us welcome our speakers once again and then get stuck in.
Oh, thank you, Jack. Well, I think we just start off with each person just speaking about what this topic really means to them at a personal level and their passion. And for those of you who are present in the audience, keep some of your ideas active, because we'll turn to you towards the end of our session to be able to take probably a couple of questions as we're able, and then interact with those. And we welcome those who are joining us online, and grateful for your time and commitment this morning. So Olivia, tell us what is the kind of personal passion for you as you address our topic today, coping with the climate crisis?
I think that it's, my mic's working. Is that right?
They want you to slide the slide. I think that'll do it. Yeah, now it's working.
All right, wonderful. Well, I think that every single person has a stake in the climate crisis. Every single person is living through the effects now and will be affected into the future. But I think that I particularly came at climate justice, at climate activism from a perspective of social activism. I was really active in, a more like humanitarian stance. And once my eyes were open to the fact that the climate crisis is a humanitarian problem, that's what really engaged me, it touched my heart, and from there sort of started my journey.
Thank you. Tony.
Thank you. So I'm a grandfather, I'm a humanitarian, and I'm an environmentalist. And on each one of those, climate change impacts me deeply. So my grandchildren won't have the joy and the same experience of the environment that I did. They'll have many more challenges and even dangers because of it. As a humanitarian, I see such suffering already. It's not in 100 years, it's today. And as an environmentalist, this beautiful environment that we enjoy, what's left of it, stands to be lost. So it affects me very, very deeply, but I don't stay there. It's a challenge, not to be accepted as fait accompli, but something to do, to act on and fight it.
Thanks, Tony. Jack.
My little microphone here. Well, I'm a student and I'm a member of the youth, and I believe the climate crisis affects the youth as probably largest out of any demographic. So I think this climate crisis is really, really important for the youth to get involved, because it's about their future and the futures of other generations, and we will have to live with the effects that are caused for our whole entire life. So I think it's really important to get involved now. Otherwise, it'll be too late and we might not even have a future to get involved into. So that's my position.
And I think that in some of the information we circulated before this conversation, we were just quoting some figures from surveys, which indicates the very high level of awareness and concern, and also the impact amongst younger people for these questions of climate and what's being said about it. Tony, I might just turn to you and just ask you just to tell us what it was like in your work empowering people at the grassroots. Because often, we'll come back to this, we want to look towards governments to have action, but I think what you've really highlighted in your work is activating and encouraging people at a grassroots to make a difference. Just tell us how that's worked for you.
Sure. So I started my work on the edge of the Sahara Desert in West Africa in the early 1980s. And I didn't know so much about climate change back then, but we were certainly facing a crisis. People were often hungry, leaving home, and from time to time, mostly children died of starvation. The desert was encroaching, people had deforested the land, and the attitude was, what can you do about it? Maybe it was the fault of the colonialists, maybe partly the government, and so on. The real battle was, yes, there is some level of responsibility on other, but the turning point came when people accepted their own responsibility for their part in the destruction that had happened. It wasn't until people were saying, yes, it's mine as well, and in a sense, repented of that in terms of changing behaviour. If it was cutting down trees that largely contributed to this problem, what can I do to repair the damage? That was the turning point. And if anything, you know, people expect maybe this is some big technological breakthrough, maybe millions of dollars were thrown at it. Not at all. It was through the empowering of people to discover and work with the gifts that God had given them, the natural environment, work with it instead of destroying it, and then go on to flourish. And it was actually, I was going to say transformational, it was revolutionary. Over the following 20 years, reforestation spread at the rate of 250,000 hectares per year, largely without my knowledge. This was a people movement. And I really want to emphasize there's a tendency, yes, government has a responsibility. Yes, big companies have a responsibility, but change starts here. Be the change you want to see. Take the actions, even the small ones that you're able to take within your capacity. And if I could just quote this short African proverb, "Te yaya fa ankan chika kogi." Small showers, lots of small showers fill the river. What started with individual farmers on their tiny, tiny patches of land spread to 5 million hectares. Eventually, the government itself took note and changed their practices. So every little effort that an individual can make, as small as you think that is, it actually counts.
Thanks, Tony. And Jack, tell us about the efforts that are happening here that you're influencing in your school and community.
Yeah, so we have an environmental committee at our school, the Sustainable Lifestyles Initiatives Committee, and kind of reflecting what Tony was saying, it's very much kind of grassroots, like the students come up with the ideas, implement what they think, and it's really about getting what we can done in our school, because of course we don't have the world's biggest budget, and so we do what we can. So that ranges from raising awareness to actually going out to other communities. Like earlier this year, when the bushfires came through, we went out to other communities to help restore environment, stuff like that. So it's really grassroots. So whilst we may not be changing the whole entire world, we're changing our small community, which I think is really key, because as reflecting what you're saying, it's small droplets, small things that really build up to the bigger cause. So that's kind of what the SLICs aim to do, is kind of help our community focused.
And Olivia, tell us about activism. Is that activism at this grassroots level, or is it that as well as activism in seeking to influence policy? Tell us about your activist work.
I think that it's really important to consider those as in conversation and to take them together. I think that the power at a community and grassroots level is essential, that empowering individuals to make change is really, really powerful. And of course, it is sort of the impact on the individual, the impact on the community, which is being felt in the climate crisis. But especially at AYCC, my role is national, and we're forging communities across so-called Australia in my work. But I think it is really, really important to acknowledge the power and control that people in policy, people in government, people who are running corporations have, and the influence they have, and to sort of acknowledge that we as individuals have the power to make our voices heard, to influence that change making, but that change making is where a lot of the big impacts are being felt, and that a lot of people who are feeling the impacts first and worst of the climate crisis are the ones who are marginalized in other ways as well, and might feel that their voice needs to be amplified more and more.
I think that what we often don't understand as clearly is the interrelationship between climate change, the impact on local communities, often the stimulus for people then to be leaving their local communities because they don't have a sustainable lifestyle there, people movements, and generally when you have significant people movements, you get significant conflict, which often manifests itself in war. And I think that in many places we just really have some big policy gaps. And having been to the highlands of Papua New Guinea and where they've experienced droughts for some of the first times for a long time, and actually famine, they couldn't grow their sweet potato. The population of Papua New Guinea rises to something about half the Australia's population mid-century, and just the sustainability of large populations in a rural subsistence lifestyle on our doorstep is something that we're reasonably innocent about. I mean, the population of Africa, I think they're forecasting, will double in the next 100 years. The impact of the pressures on the environment are going to be very great. So what are the policy movements that we need to look at here in Australia that can be influential? Because we all know that we're a relatively rich country in a region, but we're in the scale of things, not enormous populations, not enormous influence. What are the things, what are the top priorities that we should be really pushing for our Australian government to be making policy change in? Olivia, start with you.
I think that one of the biggest policies is actually in youth engagement, youth empowerment, youth voice, in ensuring that policy is speaking to communities, to groups, at that grassroots level, and really empowering that sort of like voice of those who are directly affected. I think that brings a lot of insights, and we know that a lot of young people, especially in so-called Australia, are really, really energized to be making change on the climate, and are speaking that voice, but maybe don't have yet the power to vote, don't have the power to talk to their politicians. I think that is a really promising area of policy.
Tony.
I guess in my area of expertise within Australia, I was very surprised that farmers don't own the natural regeneration on their own land. So if a farmer does the right thing and regenerates native vegetation on the creeks and on the top of the hills and that, when they go to harvest some of that for whatever purpose, it's got a biodiversity overlay. Now, the very thing that caused deforestation in Africa was people didn't own the trees on their land. And it sounds counterintuitive. Once people had that ownership, they were very incentivized to restore the tree cover and utilize it sustainably. So I was a little bit surprised to see even in Australia you've got that restriction.
So you'd be advocating for different policies about land use and the impact of reforested land.
Well, you think of the area of Australia and the potential for carbon sequestration, for biodiversity expansion. There's no incentive for farmers to actually work with the natural environment on their land. They still have to make a living. Why should they sacrifice land that they can't benefit from? Again, it probably sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but the more they're incentivized to look after it because there'll be a benefit, the more they will practice restoration on their own land. In Africa, nobody expected farmers who are often hungry, certainly very, very poor, to sacrifice good farmland for trees. Who in their right mind would do that? Once they were given ownership of those trees, they were the most motivated. It's in my self-interest to look after the environment.
And Jack, what's your top policy changes we need nationally?
Well, I'd like to echo what Olivia's saying. I think that youth voice is also really important. But I think one of the big problems is the carbon emissions, I think, in Australia. Like, we see that Australia is one of the biggest carbon emitters directly and indirectly in the world. stage. Like we emit lots of coal, we emit lots of carbon fuels. We also produce heaps ourselves. And it's all, I honestly say, heavily ironic because we're a giant country of desert with massive offshore wind potential. We've got massive amounts of sun rays coming through. We've got lower ozone layers. I think we have a massive potential to be a really good leader in the sustainability sector, sustainable energies. But as it starts now, there's a step in the right direction of new government coming through with their policies and trying to reach carbon zero by 2050. It's a step in the right direction. But I really think that there needs to be more focus and emphasis on that, because it also comes from an economic standpoint as well. Like, not only is it good for the environment, but we see other countries in the world are now refusing to trade or putting carbon tax or becoming almost aggressive to countries which are leading corruptors of the environment. And as it stands now, we are a leading corrupter of the environment. So if we really want to preserve not only the economy, but also the livelihoods and the environment, I really think we need to address the big issue of carbon emissions. And I think one way to do that is funding more research, making more accessible for solar panels, wind farms. Like we've seen since 2010, that solar panels have become about 10 times cheaper. Batteries are becoming more and more cheaper every day. Offshore wind is now 3 times cheaper. It's becoming more effective. There's really good market, which I think we have the ability to leak into. And because whilst it's great to think about maybe trying to help other countries, in all honesty, we're failing as our own country. So we need to help ourselves before we can help others, is how I see it.
And I think Australia is quite a leader in individuals and households having uptake of sustainable energy, things like solar panels on roofs, solar heating for hot water, batteries, and then as that's unfolded, the kind of benefit from it has declined, because at one stage, earlier on, people used to get good return on the feedback of that energy into the grid. The grid's not really designed, as far as I understand it, to really cope with that too much. So now there's been a disincentivization by people getting a much lower return of anything for the energy they put into the grid. So there's a whole lot of design that probably can possibly make the individual commitment that people have seem more purposeful. And when you go near any of the big coal ports like Newcastle or Gladstone, see the ships just lined up offside and know how much coal is in there, and you think, when that coal's burnt, like how much atmospheric carbon dioxide that's going to produce. It's truly monumental and colossal. But I don't think we tend to count our exporting of fossil fuels as part of our Australian carbon emissions. So we tend to, I think, tune it down a bit, because we're actually probably, even though they're being produced here, burnt somewhere else, we're really tied into the chain of that fossil fuel industry. But go ahead, Jack.
That is also a really big issue. But I also think it's becoming less economically viable to do that. We've seen countries like our big partners, like China, have now come forward and said not only going to become 80% self-sufficient, but they're moving towards a very carbon neutral government. And we're also seeing that these less economically developed countries who are trading opportunities are now also putting up resistance towards this mass import of coal. So I think that in the end will kind of sort itself out, because less countries want to accept our coal, so they can't ship it. And on the community thing, I think Australia is a really strong community-based idea of becoming more environmentally sustainable. Like over the last 20 years, we've seen that the real drive for more environmental sustainable practices has come from community, come from local governments, not really from national government. We've actually seen national governments kind of take ownership, like, oh yeah, we did that, we're responsible for this environmental push, but it's really coming from grassroots, which is really amazing. But I think it can be amplified if we've got our national government, national cabinet to really push for it, which I think is starting to become more viable with the new government coming through. They say they're going to cut emissions by 47% around then between 2030, and these new policies coming through to cap massive carbon emitters it's a good step in the direction. I think now is the time to really push for it, because we've got this new government who wants to stay in power. I think they're much more open to the youth and much more open to ideas of becoming more environmentally sustainable. So I think now is really as good a time as any. It's the best time to really start pushing for more national action of ourselves. And as I said before, other countries are going to stop accepting our coal and our iron. So we have to do something now, is as I see it.
And whilst Olivia said that often youth are not of an age to vote, I think that if you have a strong opinion and you engage with your local politicians to the extent that they influence policy in their different areas, and you invited them to your school, and you put the views of those of you, not because you're voters and you can influence, but because you have a strong opinion, I suspect that is quite influential. So I think there's much agency that young people can have that will be heard if you try and connect it to the people who are the decision makers. But I'm really grateful. I had one comment this morning. Someone said to me when I was just talking while you were having your party pies and other delights at the morning tea, one person said, "Oh, I didn't think that religious people believed in climate change." Now, which I value as a comment, because I think that the views we have, whether they're views of either scientism, that science will solve everything, or that, you know, it's not our problem, somehow God will look after it. These are real issues in how we address it. But Tony, you've got a well-articulated position as to why religious people, Christian people in particular, should care about climate change.
Oh, certainly. So in the first instance, nobody would refuse to help somebody who's hungry. Just Christian compassion, we're actually commanded to help the hungry. What's the difference between that and preventing that hunger in the first place, all that unnecessary suffering? So as Christians, we're obliged to do this, but not that I'm a great theologian, but what strikes me in Scripture is that at the time of creation, if you read Job, if you read Proverbs, there was delighting and rejoicing in the sons of men and the act of creation. There was a great party in heaven. All the angels in heaven were shouting. And I did the maths. I don't know how many angels, but in one verse it says 10,000 times 10,000. Now, can you imagine 1,000 MCGs filled with angels shouting? The noise. I don't hear any shouting today at the act of destruction. And the same God who created the earth actively upholds creation and the whole of the universe by the word of his mouth. And one day I'd read this scripture in the Psalms, and I think it was Psalm 144 or something, but I quickly forgot it. But that day we drove out to the villages, and there was this barren landscape, a particular type of soil. When you remove the vegetation, it turns to concrete. And it was just rock solid. And I thought, nothing will ever grow here. It'll take a century of lots of money and technology and so on. However, it had rained the day before, and I looked down at my feet, and there was a little crack, and a plant was popping through this crack. And then I recalled the verse, his spirit moves over the surface of the earth and renews the face of the earth. And I realized that God is not only in the business of redeeming broken humanity and saving souls, God's actively involved in the restoration of his creation. And that gave me great courage. Each one of us, if we're doing this work, we're not out there alone fighting climate change, fighting loss of biodiversity. We're on God's side. God's on our side. And he will actively help us and support us in that work. I just found that so powerful.
I've just been to the Lambeth Conference of Bishops in England, gathering bishops from across the world, and one of the calls you put out was about environmental sustainability, and also the links into how we look, you know, institutionally, how we invest, how all of our institutions, where they put their funds, what ethical investment looks like from the perspective of the climate crisis. And I think there's many layers when you look through it. But Olivia, do you encounter amongst young people only people who are excited to do something about the climate crisis? Or do you encounter people who don't care, and your task seems to be to try and motivate them to care? Is it that youth are all as uniformly enthusiastic as we might give the impression this morning?
Well, embarrassing enough to say, I was at one point a young person who didn't really understand the climate crisis. I would have said, I don't know if I would have said I didn't care, but I certainly wasn't as engaged as I am now. I think a lot of young people are on a spectrum between sort of not having the opportunity to become informed, or becoming so informed that they are crippled by anxiety and climate grief and are feeling really disempowered, and that too can be a really paralyzing force. And I think that a lot of young people are finding now that they are sort of becoming overwhelmed by that feeling that that they are fighting alone, because, like you say, Tony, that can be a really difficult thing, and it can be really empowering once you realize that you are not alone, and that lots of people are struggling with climate anxiety, but that lots of people are also sort of like finding ways to renew themselves, finding ways to reconnect with land, with their communities, and to sort of become passionate again.
Yeah, I think that's why I've been keen this morning to try and emphasise what we can do, because I think there's a kind of a human response to overwhelming risk, which is to sort of shut down and just not regard it. And that's one of the arguments that was used about the global financial crisis, that people knew there was risk there, but the risk seemed to be so catastrophic that everyone just carried on their business as normal. I mean, there's been risk since my childhood of nuclear war, probably no less risk than there ever was, but almost no one I run into has the slightest concern about there being a nuclear explosion that they've got to. It was interesting. I found a little drawing book from when I was in year 7 at school. I wasn't a great artist, but I did one of a kind of front page of a newspaper, and it was like an atom bomb going, the mushroom cloud, and I kind of drew that, and I drew these little billboards that were part of saying there's atomic explosion. Read page 3. Only part I can't work out is why I thought it'd be on page 3. But it just made me aware that even from my childhood, that was an issue. But basically, I've lived most of my life without hearing a great deal of public concern or public policy development or public urgency about mitigating that risk. And so I think really high risks like a climate catastrophe, there's always a danger we sort of shut off. We get to a certain sort of point and think, oh, well, that's kind of it. I just can't live in that space. And I think, as you've said, Olivia, there's really a big emotional cost as you invest in that. You can become very alarmed. We know there's a danger there. So emphasising what we can do often is an important thing in sustaining something rather than just sort of parking it. But I think we're going to turn soon to you and the audience here for your questions, and Jack will come back to the microphone in about 5 minutes. So just get ready, because we'll probably might be able to take 2 rounds of questions, maybe about 6 questions in total. So sorry, a lot of the things you might want to say won't be possible for everyone. But just as we kind of bring to the conclusion this part of it, what's the just give each of you really the chance to say to this group of people who are gathered here, what's your most central and urgent message to us here today? Olivia?
I think that for me, it would probably be that all of us have the power to unite within ourselves, within our communities, at a global and national level. That change is important, and so is making that change in a community where people are supporting each other, looking out for each other, uplifting the voice of those who are marginalized, and that sort of that idea that there can be no sort of climate action without climate justice and without supporting every single person's voice and well-being.
Thank you. Danny.
Thank you. I've actually got a quote from author and speaker John Maxwell, and I'm going to stand up. It's really
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So, hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. And I was certainly an angry young boy when I saw the destruction of the environment in beautiful northeast Victoria. But hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to stand up and make a difference. Hope's not hype. It's not just saying things will get better. It's showing things can get better. It's entering the arena of action. Hope is rolling up your sleeves and saying, not only I have hope in my heart, but I'm going to work hope in my life. And I stood up deliberately because it's really, really powerful. Hope doesn't fall out of the sky. It doesn't happen by chance. You make it happen. So please don't give up. Whatever it is that God's put in your heart to do, it might not be reforesting the edge of the Sahara Desert. It might be completely different, but do it with all your heart.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you for standing up to emphasise that. Jack, what's the one message you'd like to leave us with?
Well, my message kind of echoes what they've said about having hope and getting involved and being really active. But I think kind of directly to the youth, especially those around my age who are going to come into the stage where they can have votes, that their voice will be heard. I think one of the really key things to do is become really informed. Like, you'd be so much easier than you think to get informed about what's happening in the environment, what you can do as a person, getting involved in community, and don't underestimate how much your vote and your voice matters, as I say. So yeah, I think one key message is have hope, get involved in your communities, and really use your powers that we are allowed to have our freedom. Really use your voice for the betterment environment, for what you think really should help secure our future. So I think really getting into it, really spreading the word is really key, as I said, and not fall to the trap of apathy. Don't be scared of climate change. We can beat it.
Thanks, Jack. And Jack, our MC, is going to take the podium, I think, and invite questions. And Father Yu has a microphone, a roving mic. So we'll wait till he or someone else with a microphone comes to speak into that, and we'll probably take 3 questions at a time. Thanks, Jack.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, let us first just give a round of applause for all of our speakers. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Thank you. As the Archbishop said, we'll have a couple of rounds of questions, taking them in groups of 3. So, gentlemen with the microphone already, thank you.
Hi, this one's to Tony. So you talked about how you spent a lot of time in Nigeria, but you also talked about the population of Africa doubling. And so early in the year in geography, we were learning about climate refugees. So with this rise of desertification, a large portion of the population in areas of Nigeria have had to leave because and that has also been a combination of migrating to areas like Lagos, but also actually migrating to parts of Europe. And statistics are showing that I think by 2050 or 2100, there will be 100 million climate refugees coming out of Africa. So what's our responsibility as Australia, as a government, but also like as an individual, to help with climate refugees?
Well, I think thank you for that question. And it's such a complex issue. But I think the first responsibility, the most sensible first step, is to help people to survive and thrive in their own environment, in their own countries. And even though those numbers are very, very big, many countries in Africa have the potential to feed far larger populations than what they currently have. Now, that doesn't mean let's not do anything about family planning. Of course, we need to do that with the people, not dictating, not shoving it down their throats. But the first step would be to help people appreciate the gifts that they've got, how to use them sustainably, and to meet the needs of their population. Secondly, and I really don't have the answers to this, what would a Europe or a US or an Australia do with 100 million people on your shores? I'm not sure that I've worked that out myself, and so I guess I defer back to option number 1. Let's work in the countries themselves first off.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll take the next 2 or so questions just as a group and then pass them out. So yes, thank you, up the back.
G'day, Mr. Ronaldo. I'm a farmer from New South Wales, central New South Wales, on the border here at Melbourne Grammar. I was kind of basing a question more, something I could take back to my community. And so I just want to know, what can I do going forward to help reduce my footprint, as well as to influence my community while still maintaining animal ethics? I come from a large farm with about 35,000 sheep and 1,000 cattle. So I think I've got a quite large footprint, and I'd like to know how I can help reduce, nitrogen emissions, and how I can reduce, the problems that we have with farming mass amounts of livestock.
Thank you.
I think we're going to take a couple more questions, Tony, before we respond. Jack's going to field a few more questions.
Yes, we're taking this as a group. So yes, just across there. Thank you. Sorry, there's a microphone just coming your way.
Thank you. I'm Tony Meath, Principal of Melbourne Girls Grammar, and thank you for having this conversation today. It's really lovely to be here. There is a lot of research around the correlation between children being exposed early to the environment through camping and bushwalking, etc., and then their awareness and their advocating for the environment later in life. I'd be interested to hear from the panel, what was your experience as a young child, and has that led to your kind of awareness? And can we then do something in education where every young child is exposed to that early. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more question and then pass that to the group. Do we have a... Yes, right there. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm quite a keen economics student here. I've heard economics being mentioned a couple of times. And obviously, let's just put it simply, money kind of run this world, right? And economic is one of the biggest challenges to governments and people being empowered and being willing to fight the climate crisis and promote this kind of change. And my question is kind of, what can we do to convince society and kind of our world that, you know, we should sacrifice these economic benefits and other things that we humans, you know, inherently want to fight this kind of climate crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's put these questions to the panel.
So the first one was directly to you, Tony, about the what could be done for the big sheep farm at the Riverina.
Yeah, thank you. So you actually have a wonderful opportunity to be a carbon farmer. And by that, there's a whole suite of practices that fall under this umbrella, regenerative agriculture. So the way you manage those sheep, the way you conserve your soils, you can actually store carbon in the soil itself. Is your land completely cleared? Is there an opportunity there to strategically place windbreaks and trees on the gullies and the hilltops? Again, you're storing carbon, but you're not giving something up, and it addresses the economics question too. I get this all the time with farmers. How could you possibly expect me to put trees on my land? I need to live. You're not giving something up, you're gaining so much more. Your cost of inputs will reduce, your land productivity will increase, and I would argue you will actually enjoy farming so much more because you're working with nature instead of always striving against it.
That was interesting. Just as I came in this morning, the person who's the receptionist in the headmaster's office, we just had a bit of a conversation coming here, and she said, "Oh, I've not been here that long." I said, "Oh, what work did you leave to come to this work at Melbourne Grammar?" She said, "Well, I've been doing this kind of environmental entrepreneurship about fish farming at Avalon and integrating that with producing this kind of seaweed product that cows could eat, which reduces their methane emissions through their digestion." You know, she's just a link with the economics question. You know, said, "Well, look, as an entrepreneur, you've still got to earn some income to make these things happen." But it's just so, I thought it was just so pertinent. My first encounter walking through the door of the school was someone who's, you know, on this cutting edge of wanting to make a difference as an investor in an innovative kind of an industry. And so I think it's just right in front of us all the time. So isn't that a delightful thing? But I think we had another aspect, did we, about our first exposure to nature and what influence that's had?
Well, myself personally, I was really, really lucky to grow up with a big backyard, but also a dad who would take me out camping. Like you mentioned, that can be a really, really powerful way of opening up children's eyes, being allowed to get dirty and interact with the world and be curious and start developing that really emotional investment in protecting what you've enjoyed and what has given so much to you. But I also had a lot of privilege living in the suburbs. I had the privilege of not interacting with my environment all the time, of not having a very tangible stake in my early life in the game of environmental conservation. And so I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge that as well, and acknowledge that I had the privilege of enjoying in small doses and then disconnecting at times, which slowed my connection.
Mm. Okay. I grew up in Myrtleford, northeast Victoria, and if I stepped outside my backyard, I was in the bush, so that was my playground. And I walked over those hills, I climbed the trees. If I went in the other direction, we'd go swimming in the Ovens River, we'd go fishing. The thing that influenced me so much was they were bulldozing that bush that I love so much and leaving steep hills barren. And I didn't know ecology, but it didn't make sense to me. Loss of species, erosion, and I wondered what on earth, what short-term profit, is it worth destroying the earth for short-term gain? And insecticides drifting into that river that we swam in and drank from and fished in, it didn't make sense. And I think I mentioned earlier, I was very angry. I was very frustrated because I wasn't eloquent like Jack. I didn't have a voice. But the one thing that I could do, my mum had a very strong faith, and I just said this kid's prayer, please God, use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And I think God's honoured that prayer, but the environment greatly affected me at that age.
Yeah, well, our school, Melbourne Grammar, has a really inclusive environmental program. So we've got programs like the LGR, which is essentially where kids in groups go out to the environment and spend up to 10 days literally just camping throughout the environment, making a trek, going from point A to point B. We've also got the BTG, Beyond the Gates program, which once again puts kids out in the environment for 3 weeks, and they go experience large impacts of what the environment's like, what's being out there in the forest, which is really amazing. I think it was one of the big inspirations for me to actually really get into the environmental process. It's like on one of my first ever LGRs, which is when I went with a group of 8 boys out to the Alpine National Park. We were out there for 5-6 days. And the 3rd day through, we spent 3 days climbing up this massive mountain. We felt like we were really isolated in the middle of the environment. Like nothing was there. It was all untouched. Well, that's what we thought until we got to the top. And we looked over and there was a massive deforestation area. There was about, as far as the eye could see, for like ages, a whole block of trees completely destroyed, being burnt and not being replanted, or what I was aware of. But it was where there were native trees there. There probably would have been massive amount of species there, completely demolished and gone. And it really kind of spoilt the experience for me, which I was there. And that really kind of opened my eyes up that everywhere is affected by our touch now. We can't really escape it. So I think on the question you said, how could we implement this into an education policy? I think really pushing that idea of getting students to go out there, really get involved and actually see firsthand the environment. Because like, as it now, a lot of us are quite sheltered. We live here in the city and we don't really see how impacted the actual environment is firsthand. Not a lot of us have the privilege to do that. So by doing that, that really at least inspired me. I know it's inspired a lot of my other friends, and I think it could really be a good point in the education department to actually push that exposure to the effects on the environment firsthand.
I think my exposure early in my life as an adult, as a young adult, was in Torres Strait and Cape York Peninsula, and just living there with traditional people who'd always lived on those lands and seas, and having a sense of the immensity of a natural world, of a kind of a wilderness area, and in a sense how much for people living in that kind of subsistence and sustainable lifestyle, how much country was needed to support them. That really, you get a strong sense in that context of humans being small in the big picture of nature, and you need the big picture of nature for us to survive in that kind of lifestyle. And of course, with agriculture and other kind of things, it gets more intensified until you almost get, as a city dweller, you get a bit disconnected. As long as there's stuff in the supermarket, just keep pulling it out. Where it comes from, well, we don't really know. And so as I've lived my life, I think this is getting crazier. We're getting, mangoes from the Philippines, oranges from California. Why would anyone in the world say, well, maybe the fruit's not in season. Maybe we don't need to bring them out here with all that air miles and all that fossil fuel being spent. But we kind of, as city dwellers, we tend to get pretty detached from how big nature is and how much we depend on it. So I think that learning to depend on nature was really formative for me.
And we're much more vulnerable than what we like to admit. That depending on what text you read, up to 75% of the world's soils are degraded.
Yes.
95% of our food comes from that stuff that we call dirt. And as temperatures rise, it's getting harder and harder to grow crops. Plants simply can't cope with the stress. So it doesn't come from the supermarket, it comes from the land.
And I think we've seen here in Victoria that, despite the heroic efforts of many settlers in the Mallee, clearing the Mallee and trying to, farm it by conventional techniques, much of the Mallee isn't actually a place where you can sustain that kind of agriculture. It really has to be a different kind of a land use than the kind of clear and an open kind of ploughed grain farming. It can be done, but it's a different sort of technique you need. But the question about, I think the last question was about the economics. How do we get real with what was the phrase you used? Money is pretty central, or money is important in the middle of things. So how do we get real with that money story about things and what we're talking about?
Oh, I actually don't think this is a question for me. Yeah, economics is not my wheelhouse. Am I for you, Tony?
Well, I think you're exactly right, and it's just going to be common sense. It'll be cheaper to work with renewables. The price is coming down all the time. It makes economic sense. Your costs go down, your profits go up. That will drive it ultimately. It's just a pity that people don't have the foresight to act earlier rather than later when they have to. Why wait till you've got no option when you can start making a profit from it now? And what I said before, that thing about farmers, you're not actually giving something up. When you invest, it's not a wasted expense. This is an investment in the future and in better business practices. And even if you think in terms of markets, and I think you referred to this, people simply stop buying from the dirty companies. Where did you source that palm oil? The orangutans are suffering. The land is being destroyed. I won't buy that palm oil anymore. It'll only be the sustainable companies that have got a market.
Yeah, echoing that, I think that question can't kind of be broken down to two areas. So I think one of the areas is that in terms of a commercial level, I think you're completely right in saying money runs our society. I think it's just a fact we have to bear with. But I think we can use that. So as I see it, especially like more of a capitalist or society like ours, the market responds to what people want. So I think on our level, we have a power then to influence the market to start pushing towards more environmental. If we see a large push by buying more sustainable sources of materials, we'll see the market respond by adapting to making everything more sustainable, because in the end they want to make money, and if we're not buying it, they're going to have to shift their whole entire economic standpoint in order to make money. So I think that's one thing we have power over with this economy that we have. But I think on a national level, I see it, I think we will not be able to avoid some sort of economic detriment in one way. So whilst it costs money to make it a more environmentally sustainable Australia, that's something we have to do, and that's going to make an economic impact. But if we don't at the same time, if we try to reserve money, we will once again be hit by trade tariffs by other countries. And either way, I think it's unavoidable in order to actually not have any economic impact. So as I see it now, if we get involved now in research, we can actually mitigate the impact of going towards a more environmental sustainability way. I think it's just better and much better in the long term as well if we switch to a more environmental aspect for the economy as well, as kind of echoed over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think to be good guests, I need to wrap up now, because I know this is a school. After all, there will be sounds ringing for people to go to class, and there will be a usage of this room that we need to vacate to make it possible. So really grateful for your attendance today. We will explore whether we can have another one of these with a student group, perhaps into next year, and we'll let you know about that. We're really grateful for that, and grateful for the hospitality of Melbourne Grammar School, and grateful for each of our participants today. So why don't you just thank them, and then I'll conclude with a prayer. So I'll just pray as we finish. And firstly, I'll say a prayer in the Wurrung language of the Wurundjeri people. Lord God, bless your people always, and grant us the wisdom to see in the times in which we live those things which are your call upon us as responsible stewards of creation, to care for and to nurture the good things you've given us, and make us worthy in our generation of the vision we have, and help us be the change that we want to see in the world around us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, thanks once again.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.